Hello, good afternoon and welcome to the News on the Block Leasehold Knowledge Week. I'm delighted to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Elizabeth England from 5 Paper, who is going to discuss service charges apportionment based on fair proportion. Elizabeth specialises in residential and landlord tenant law, and her practice is exclusively concerned with the management of housing, from assisting local authorities and social housing providers to private management companies and individual lessees. Elizabeth, over to you. I know you're happy to take as many questions as people wish to put to you. And if they use the Q&A box in the middle, down at the bottom, you will answer questions throughout the presentation at 4 different parts. Is that fine?
That's absolutely right. This is an unusual situation. It's a situation we would rather be not in. Coming to you from North London, my home, as is Charlotte. We would much rather be in front of you in person, taking questions from the floor. And to that extent, we are encouraging, I certainly do encourage you to ask me questions as we go along. I'm going to be talking to you about principles of apportionment, what a fair, due, proper, reasonable proportion looks like, how to make lawful decisions. I'm going to then be putting that in the context of a decision that was made in the High Court in February this year called Criterion Buildings Limited and McKinsey. And then we'll be extrapolating some useful principles to apply more widely. So I'm going to invite you to think about questions you'd like to ask me generally and specifically after the kind of fair proportion, reasonable section, then after the criterion building section, and then after useful principles. So do be thinking about that. Here till 3 o'clock. It's 14:03 now. So without any further ado, let's get on. So that's the outline of what we're going to be talking about today. General principles of apportionment, what is fair, proper, due, reasonable, the Criterion Buildings Limited and McKinsey case, useful questions. So the principles of apportionment are usually set out right in the lease. We all know that. They need to be understood and considered properly. And when I'm sitting in the first tier tribunal, the first thing the tribunal will ask is for the lease to be explained to them. So we usually have an interrogation of what the lease says, what the terms are, what can be claimed, what can't be claimed, and what the principles of apportionment are within it. And usual contractual principles apply. If there is any difficulty with interpreting the lease, so an interpretation point, the Contra Preferendum rule applies. And Contra Preferendum is simply that the benefit of the doubt goes to the person who didn't draft the document. So it will usually go to the tenant in their favour. There's a limit to the amount of service charges you can charge. They have to be reasonable, and they have to be effectively Section 19 and Section 27 capital A of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985 look at whether they are properly charged under the lease and whether they are reasonable in amount. We then have to look at what if the lease says, for example, a fair apportionment needs to be made. So some terms say a fair proportion, some say a proper proportion, some say a due proportion, others may say a reasonable proportion. These import another difficulty into interpretation of the lease. And the method of apportionment might then be fixed or variable according to the way that the surveyor, and it's usually a surveyor, will make that calculation. And that might be on some prevailing rateable value in commercial premises, or based on floor space, or some other method that appears to be fair or proper or due or reasonable in the context of the building that you're looking at. So if the lease does give you one of these unfortunate terms, fair, proper, due, reasonable, or something along those lines, the first thing to look at is the Rix Code of Practice. And interestingly, the Rix Code of Practice for commercial property is explicit, but the Rix Code of Practice for residential properties, 3rd edition, is silent about this issue. So although I deal with pretty much 100% with the odd commercial case scattered in once or twice a year, maybe, I would always go back to the commercial property code because it contains a term that is helpful, and that term is demonstrably fair and reasonable. And I will be coming back to this demonstrably fair and reasonable point later on. So the Rix Code of Practice says where the lease doesn't make specific reference to the basis of apportionment and, for instance, refers to a fair and reasonable proportion as determined by the landlord surveyor, the landlord surveyor acting as an expert is required to adopt a basis of calculation that conforms with the basic principles of service charge apportionment. That's helpful because we know it's a basic principle of service charge apportionment that would need to be demonstrably fair and reasonable to ensure that individual tenants bear an appropriate, fair and reasonable proportion of the total service charge expenditure, which reflects the benefit of the services enjoyed. So residential management code does not explicitly make that reference to demonstrably fair, but what it does say is, depending on the terms of the lease, the basis and method of apportionment, well, there it is, should be demonstrably fair and reasonable to ensure that the individual occupiers bear an appropriate proportion of the total service charge expenditure. So it's demonstrably fair and reasonable. What we know from that is there is no one-size-fits-all approach. It's important that all of the elements of the building development are considered, and it is also important that that is regularly reviewed. So it sometimes is the case that someone says, well, landlord says, we've been doing this for 30 years since we've had this building. There might be things that have changed in the building. You would have to still be able to demonstrate in 2021 or in 2022, whenever it is, that the apportionment is demonstrably fair at that point. And an interesting case, it was unreported and decided in 2007, Scottish Mutual Assurance and Jardine Public Relations. The tenant in that case was given a bill for major works of quite a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money. And the tenant said, it's not reasonable to charge me for this, this money, and it was a commercial lease, because I'm going to be at the end of my lease term in, I think it was even 18 months. Why can't you avoid the major works just for now, and the new incoming tenant will have the benefit of it? And the tribunal were strangely persuaded by that argument. I think one might say, if there has been an absence of major works for a long period of time, that there has been arguably perhaps a period of dilapidation. But on the major works issue, if they're not going to have the benefit of the major works, then actually what would be fair and reasonable for that particular tenant might be less if the benefit of it would not be felt because they only have a few months left after the end of the major works project before the end of their lease term. So that is a consideration as well. Another case, Past Properties and Hayes, the heating bills were calculated by the London Borough of Hackney in a building that, in an estate that had 2 buildings, and one of the buildings had a gas-fired communal heating system, and that powered all the units in that particular building, but each flat in the building was fitted with a meter, and the second building didn't, but had a system that was communal to all parts. So there was a difference between the way that the two buildings were dealt with in terms of their heating provision. One had the gas-fired communal heating in all of that one unit, the other didn't. But all of the flats had meters. The landlord unfortunately ignored all the meter readings because they said it was too expensive to be looking at each individual meter, and basically apportioned the heating bill between all the units in both buildings. So you can imagine if you were in the building that didn't have the heat provided to it and getting a bill for the heating for building 1, you'd be a bit annoyed. The upper tribunal said that it's not a reasonable approach, and said the only way of calculating fairly how much heating everybody was using was to use the meters. And so in that case, it wasn't fair just to take a sweep of what the lease said. It was only fair if you used the meters available. So before we go on to the Criterion building case, I'll talk to you about Criterion, which is quite a famous building in central London. Just to round up this section of the talk and to invite questions, the framework I am encouraging you to look at is what is demonstrably fair and reasonable when you have one of these terms. And that has to be demonstrable according to your surveyor and the context of the buildings. So on one hand, you've got an upheld decision where a landlord can demonstrate it's been fair and reasonable. And the other, I suppose, if you've got two buildings and you're apportioning services which aren't actually being enjoyed by one building, it's easy to say that that's probably not reasonable. So it might be a case where you look at it and say, I can't say what's not reasonable unless I'm just, it's like describing an elephant. How do you describe an elephant without referring to an elephant? These things are easy to see in practice, but difficult to describe from afar. I'm going to pause. Charlotte, have you got any questions?
Yes, we do. We have a question from Graham. In a mixed-use building, mixed-use building, there is a loading bay which serves the residential and commercial units, but the commercial uses it much more, even though the residential has equal access. Should it be on a square footage basis as per the rest of the building services, or by use apportionment?
Okay, so demonstrably fair and reasonable. Charlotte, you might have to mute yourself so there's no feedback, sorry. It's one of the exciting elements of Zoom. So demonstrably fair and reasonable, it means you have to demonstrate your reasoning. So Graham, what I'd say is if you can demonstrate that there is greater use by the commercial premises than the residential premises, then you can justify a decision to charge the commercial premises more for the use of that loading bay than you would the residential premises. But unless you've got some pretty good statistics that could back up a percentage, for example, so if you did a survey on a day or a week, or you invited feedback on a survey sent to all users of the loading bay, how often do you use it? Once a week, twice a week, every day? You might get a response back that allows you to apportion things differently. But I would caution against that, actually, because you're applying a very subjective analytical approach. Whereas I would say in your case, you are actually probably on a more demonstrably fair footing to say everybody has equal access to the loading bay, and it would be open to any user to use it more or less as they wish. It's like saying we're going to charge someone for using the front door of a communal access building. but some people will use it more or less depending on what circumstances. So, for example, if somebody moves house, you're going to charge them more for using the loading bay on a certain day. It seems to me that would be fraught with difficulties. And it's also difficult taking a long-term approach. So you're looking at a subjective approach over maybe a short period of time or with particular tenants in situ, whereas that approach might not be fair or demonstrably fair in a year's time or 2 years' time. So I suppose you could take a view that it's more fair to have an unequal contribution weighted against the commercial premises in the short term, but you'd have to review that regularly. But I think according to available use, so everybody has equal availability to use that at any time, therefore there is an equal apportionment, is probably the more demonstrably fair in the long term. Graham, do you want to come back to me on that?
Okay, I have got another couple of questions. In the lease, one of our buildings states both blocks should pay towards the lift costs, maintenance and servicing. However, only one block has actual access to the lift. Does fair and reasonable override the lease? Do you want me to do the other question, or do you want to do the
I can answer that really quickly. Based on the Hackney case, that was past Property Services v Hayes, I think that you would be unsuccessful in defending that position. I think it is demonstrably fair and reasonable for the users of the lift to have to pay for it, and people who don't even have access to it shouldn't have to pay for the lift. That seems reasonably straightforward, because when you say it overrides the lease, unfortunately these or fortunately, whatever way you look at it, Section 27, capital A, and Section 19, the 85 Act, all point to a limit on service charges subject to reasonableness. But they have to be objectively and demonstrably fair and reasonable. Next one, Charlotte.
I have, what would your view be of a situation where there are 37 apartments, but 6 of the flats have balconies, which are intended to be a means of a fire escape for the 6 flats, but there is no access to the balconies from the other apartments. There is no mention of balconies in the lease, and we have a proper apportion lease.
That seems, again, reasonably straightforward, that if they are not demised to any particular lease, then they are communal for means of fire escape. I'm sure that they wouldn't be locking their front doors and stopping anybody else from escaping the building if that was required. So I think means of escape in a communal setting is going to be apportioned to all. I think that's demonstrably fair and reasonable, unless there's a reason why it's demonstrably unfair.
And Graham says, thank you. I think the square footage is a fair basis and everyone is on an equal footing and equal access. So that's all the questions done for this section. Do you
Excellent.
want to carry forward, keep going?
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, well, let's have a look at Criterion Buildings and McKinsey. And I quite like this case. I think it's a really interesting case, and an interesting case that when it came out prompted me and my colleagues, and also me and a couple of my neighbours, to have a decent debate about whether it was rightly decided or not. So hopefully it will prompt the same here, one that I've got quite excited over. It's a High Court decision. His Honour Judge Matthews sitting as the judge of the High Court, so it's not Court of Appeal authority, neither is it upper tribunal authority, but it's still binding and useful for us to look at. But its value lies in its geography and location. It's a very famous building, the Criterion building. Apparently, it's in central London, Soho. It's otherwise known as 1 Jermyn Street, and I've got a picture of it here. And you'll see that it's got lily whites on the far right-hand side. Then it's got a theatre, and you can see that there's a show there, I think it says Bank Rob, which sounds quite exciting. When we go back to theatres, I'm sure they'll be showing again. And then there's office buildings adjacent to it. So that's an office block, commercial offices. And there is one freeholder over the entirety. So it's 3 adjacent buildings on an island site in Piccadilly Circus. Got Lily White's, Criterion Theatre and restaurant, and then offices known as 1 Jermyn Street. And the lease term was to pay the landlord the due proportion of the service charge and to observe and perform the tenant's obligations relating to the service charges. So far, so good. So this is pay a due proportion of the service charges. And then, very helpfully, they went on to define the due proportion as a fair proportion to be determined from time to time. I won't go on. If you ask for the notes of this talk or the slides, they are available from News on the Block, so you can enjoy the full term. But the things I want to draw out, the due proportion is calculated by a fair proportion. So far, so good. So what the tenant of the office block, so the office block said, what the landlord was charging as the due proportion didn't comply with the lease because it wasn't fair. So we're going to go on a roundabout circular argument just for a little while. They said that the service charge favoured another tenant, which was the Criterion Theatre and restaurant, at the office block's expense. And the tenant believed, and it was right, that the apportionment was based on interior floor space. Now, what Criterion Buildings Limited had done is they'd, a number of years ago, basically decided that a fair proportion would be based on floor space. So if you can imagine, if you're in an office block and you have several floors of space, then you have more floor space than a theatre, which has a lot of empty space because the floor space is the stage and then tiered seating, which is going to be less than if it had regular floors without any holes in and big empty space. So the office block were a bit cheesed off that they were paying more, when in fact the theatre and the restaurant, which occupied a high-ceilinged building, a high-ceiling room within the building, were being charged less because they just simply had less floor space. So the office block basically campaigned relentlessly over a period of years for the landlord to reassess the way that they apportion the due apportionment on a more fair footing. And the landlord said, no, this is long and established. This is totally long and established. This is what we've been doing for years. Nobody else has ever complained. We are quite happy with our floor space apportionment. Undeterred, McKinsey said, well, hang on, we've got another report here from another surveyor who says there is a different way of apportioning which makes things a lot more fair. So we have our more fair method of apportionment that we would like you to adopt, please. Landlord comes back. No, our predecessor in title apportioned the service charges according to floor space, and it is indeed about internal floor space for each lettable unit, and simply because there was another method of apportionment doesn't mean that we have to follow it. Oh, where's my presentation gone? Stand by. There we go. So the nature of our dispute was that the theatre's floor space didn't represent the actual space occupied in the building, because the auditorium occupied several floors and therefore it was empty space. Empty space was not accounted for in the service charge at all, and the office tenant said that was inherently unfair. His Honour Judge Matthews said it was fair. It made absolutely no financial difference to the landlord how it apportioned the service charges. And on that basis, the judge said, look, the landlord's got no axe to grind here. It makes no difference how it apportions between its tenants. And therefore, they were entitled to take an objective approach. And the tenant is likely to be taking a subjective approach in its own favour. And it's quite notable that the other tenants didn't make representations and their reviews were not canvassed. So effectively what the judge was looking at was one tenant out of three making representations effectively for a reduction in their service charge, which would have to be subsidised by the other tenants, without reference to the other tenants, as a criticism to the landlord, who could take whatever view it wanted to as long as it was fair. So the judge said, in those circumstances, there is a reversal of the burden of evidence, effectively. It is for the tenant to show that the landlord's decision is irrational or objectively wrong. And I think that's really interesting, because that seems to me to be the absolute opposite of what is objectively fair and reasonable. To counter what is objectively fair and reasonable, you have to show irrationality. It is irrational or objectively wrong. And the tenant had done neither in that case. So before we go on to our useful principles that we can take away from that case, I'm going to invite some questions. Do you think that the decision was made correctly or not? Do you think that the office block were right to push it to court? Do you think that the landlord now has a blank canvas to make whatever decision it likes, as long as it's rational and not objectively wrong? Charlotte, have we got any questions or comments?
No, currently no comments on this. I think everyone's probably looking at it going, oh, what would I do? But no, currently no comments. Oh, hang on. Yes, one's come in. Empty space doesn't incur costs.
Oh, does it? Does it not mean you've got a higher heating cost? Does it not mean that you're taking more of a proportion of the roof? Because there is still roof over space, whether it's empty or officed. So the office block, if the apportionment of a roof repair was made, then the space for the office block would make absolutely no difference. It would be on square footage of the roof, and Criterion would have the Criterion Theatre and Restaurant would occupy more of that.
I've got another one. If the offices were vacant, I would imagine that the landlord would change the apportionment basis.
Maybe.
And then I've got another one that says, in a residential situation, should we not applying to the FTT to determine what is fair? They're the next two comments.
Oh, that's really interesting. Should you, as a matter of principle, apply for a determination and what is fair and reasonable? I suppose it depends on what your lease says. So if your lease says it's for your surveyor to make the decision, then you can employ a surveyor to go and decide. I know local authorities have employed surveyors who are used to making decisions in certain contexts, whether that's for dilapidations, disrepair, for cyclical maintenance, for major repairs projects. But on apportionment, it might be worth going to a national firm who have got insurance against a bad decision, if you like. But what I think this case gives you is a really helpful get out, which is that your decision on apportionment is, as long as it is demonstrably fair, so you can demonstrate that with a surveyor's report, And if it's not obviously wrong, like charging a building for the use of a lift, which they don't have access to, the bar is rationality. And rationality is, in legal terms, against a benchmark of a case, we say it's Wednesbury unreasonable, not the day of the week Wednesbury, but the place in the West Midlands Wednesbury. And that says that it is so irrational, so unreasonable, that no other person with the expertise and knowledge that this person had in the country would make the same decision. It's a very, very high bar. That so it simply has to be irrational, such that nobody else would have made that decision, or objectively wrong. So you can see it's just wrong on any assessment. If you haven't got access to a lift and you're not using it, and you can't even get to it, you shouldn't be paying for it. That's just objectively wrong. So that's useful. So looking at the confidence to make your own decision, I think this gives you the confidence to make it a decision, but you just have to demonstrate that that decision has been made in a rational way, within the usual things that go into the mix of a publicly rational decision. So taking into account all of the evidence, all of the subjective elements, like the size of the building, the elements in the building, the location of it, is it commercial or residential, who's using what amenities fall under the service charges, which don't, are they all being used fairly, and some metered and some not, fair use. So you take everything into the mix, and then you make a decision based on all of those elements to see what comes out at the end. And as long as you can demonstrate that you've taken everything into account and that you've come up with an apportionment that makes sense, even if it's unfair to some and favours others, I think it's fair to say, based on the principles that I've spoken about this afternoon, that as long as it is objectively right, or not objectively wrong, to put the other way, and demonstrably, so you have evidence, you can evidence the fact that it's fair and reasonable, then you should get home on that. It should be fine without you having to go to court. It gives you the confidence to make a decision.
I've got one last little comment here. Does Windermere versus Wild come into play when discussing fair or due?
Do you want to expand on Windermere and Wild? What was the principle on that? You're going to remind me and everybody else.
That's all it says currently. Maybe the person who's submitted it might put a little bit more onto that. Currently, no. Oh, it deals with section 27A. Yeah,
fine. So how does section 27A impact? That's fine. It fits straight in at it. We're being demonstrably fair and reasonable is an extension, if you like, of service charges being reasonably incurred in a reasonable amount. So what the lease. So what the statutory regime does is put a limit on your service charge bill, effectively, to that which is reasonably incurred and reasonable in amount. And this is a parallel situation where the lease is telling you to be fair or pay something due or something fluffy. It doesn't give you something firm to put your hat on. It is encouraging you into a circular philosophy, if you like, of it has to be proportionate by reference to what is due, by reference to something that is reasonable, which gives you a very wide discretion on what to do. And that fits actually quite neatly within the statutory framework as well, which is to be only charging what is reasonable in amount, in a variety of different contexts. So it does fit in that, except that the cases that I've discussed with you, and particularly Criterion and McKinsey, give you the confidence where you have a lease which doesn't give you a firm basis of assessment, where it just says do what you like as long as it's fair and reasonable, to make a decision which is simply demonstrably fair. And as long as it's demonstrably fair, then the tenant then has to show irrationality or something that is objectively wrong. And I think that that gives you a much stronger and more confident basis than, ironically, a lease that gives you a more prescriptive way of dealing with service charges, where the tribunal will be looking at a more subjective approach. Although if the tenant says, window cleaning is too expensive, they can't just say it's more expensive. They would have to say there is another firm out here that is charging half of what these guys are charging, or you have a comparable receipt or a comparable service at a lesser expense that the tenant says we've been trying to get the management company to use somebody else because it is demonstrably expensive. So the tribunal already has the idea of what is demonstrably unfair. But this test is a little bit further, not demonstrably unfair, but irrational or objectively wrong. So I think this gives you a better decision than perhaps what you would have in a more prescriptive lease with a tenant who is simply saying it's demonstrably unfair. It's the first thing we learn to say when we're children, it's not fair. But I think this takes it a little bit further to irrationality and importing public law principles into the tribunal, which we haven't had before, which I think is really interesting.
Well, that's excellent. All questions for the minute done. You've got 20 minutes left, so
Brilliant.
I will let you get on.
Yeah. Okay. So
This
is the last, in fact, the last slide. So I'm expecting lots of questions and lots of discussion points. So there's 5 bullet points here. Those of you who can't see a screen and listening on your headphones whilst you're doing something else, I'm going to read them out for you. So the first one is the surveyor must take into account a wide spectrum of considerations, which are particular to both the building and potentially to the tenant's circumstances for the remaining term of the lease. So this is what I was saying before. A useful principle is to make sure your surveyor, when they are assessing the estate or the demise or building, whatever you've asked them to assess, whether that's one building or sometimes you get large developments with 3 tower blocks on them. You have to make sure the surveyor is instructed with all of the little details that might go into the mix. And that includes heating considerations, what amenities you're planning to charge, either collectively or to individual buildings or parts of buildings. Looking at also the tenant circumstances, so that case that we looked at earlier where the tribunal had decided that in a commercial context, it wasn't fair for the outgoing commercial tenant to pay the full cost of major works upgrading the building because they wouldn't have the enjoyment of it. So in a commercial context, I think that's really interesting because that imports a subjective element of the tenant's circumstances that we are perhaps not always considering or inviting a surveyor to consider. There might be all sorts of other things like cleaners. So the cleaners might be coming to clean the internal parts of all of the buildings, but then cleaning the outer area only in front of certain other buildings. So if you've got 3 tower blocks on an estate and the cleaners come and litter pick out of 2 tower blocks and not the 3rd, then are you going to invite the surveyor to take that into consideration? It might well be the surveyor says the access to the third block is through the communal parts in front of the other two, and there are other considerations like a bin store under the third that the other two have to pay for, so it all comes out in the wash. So you've got to look at all of these little elements just to make sure that they've been considered, because the test is demonstrably fair. So as long as you can demonstrate that you've considered all of these elements, then it's likely you're going to survive a challenge. The second takeaway, I think, is that there may be a range of apportionment methods, but all the landlord has to do is choose one, and hopefully it's the most fair to all tenants. So I think a useful takeaway is that what all of these authorities show is that somebody is going to lose out somewhere, and that's almost inevitable in a big estate. That there will be things that some tenants will pay a little bit more for, and others a little bit less on the one hand, but then the reverse might be true in respect of other small costs. You are never going to please absolutely everyone. Hopefully you find a way to please most people, but what the courts have recognised is that the service charge apportionment, particularly on large estates, is complicated and it's messy, but all you have to do is demonstrate that you've gone with the most fair, not the most fair to a particular class of tenant or a particular tenant. And I rather wonder in criteria buildings whether, if the office space had succeeded, whether the theatre and the restaurant might have started to complain themselves that they were being unfairly treated. So it's always useful to, I think, keep in mind that as a landlord, you are having to do a difficult job sometimes in circumstances where the estate has unequal parts. But if you can justify your decision making, it's demonstrably fair and not irrational or objectively wrong, then you're going to survive a challenge. So I would encourage you to take into account that Rix code, what is demonstrably fair and reasonable. And that's basically in my skeleton arguments whenever I'm asked to deal with these. It goes straight back to the Rix codes, what is demonstrably fair and reasonable. And now I will be quoting Criterion as well to say the flip side is the tenant has to show that it is irrational, which is a public law concept, or demonstrably wrong. And that is subjective. It has to be subjective. You can't have a one size fits all. You can't please everybody. It's subjective insofar as the surveyor has to take into account the subject matter of the assessment. But I think the final point is the challenge to apportionment is going to be fairly limited to rationality and making a rational decision. I think those are the useful principles, and I think it's a really helpful decision for landlords, and goodness knows we need it. So that's really, I think it's an excellent decision and one that gives us a lot of confidence to see off a lot of challenge. Charlotte, are there any questions that have come up?
I do have a question for you. I have a question saying, thank you very much for answering the last question. Would you say then that the thing to be cautious of is the clause saying landlord surveyor's decision is final and binding?
No, I don't think it's a clause to be cautious of. I think it's I think it puts surveyors on the hook, basically. And you want to be, if you're for a tenant and you're worried about the landlord surveyor's decision, you're going to be wanting to know what elements have gone into the mix for that surveyor to make a decision. And actually it's the surveyor's decision which is the element that is subject to the most challenge. All the landlord has to do is say, here's our surveyor's decision, and the lease says the surveyor's decision is final. If the surveyor's decision is demonstrably wrong or irrational, such that no other surveyor with the same amount of information and evidence would have made that decision, then that surveyor better have some good indemnity insurance, because everybody will be running after them, both the landlord and the tenant. So if the tenant was successful in challenging the surveyor's decision, the landlord would want to sue them for the litigation. And if the landlord is successful, then all well and good, you've seen it off. So I wouldn't be too cautious either end of those clauses, because it gives you something to bite into. You want to see the surveyor's report and make sure that they have taken into account the things that you are concerned haven't been taken into account. And that's whether you are concerned as a landlord or the tenant.
Excellent. Okay. Right. So we haven't got any more questions at the moment. Is there any questions you'd like to ask the audience to?
Well, I'm interested
them.
I'm interested in the kind of cases that you're dealing with, where these less prescriptive apportionment principles have been applied. I don't know whether our participants are mainly commercial or residential practitioners, and whether they are thinking about landlords, defending landlords' positions, or putting forward tenant circumstances. So I'd be interested to know people's experiences. And I also think, as landlord, I mean, I represent mainly landlords, but that doesn't mean I don't represent tenants. I think I represent tenants, maybe 20–25% of the cases that I deal with are residential tenants, but mainly I deal with landlords. And landlords are always concerned about defending their position, and that can take one of two forms, either being overly defensive or insecure about their position, and so they're extremely worried about whether their decision has been fair or not, because you can always see somebody else's argument, but they have to also bear in mind that there are other tenants in a block or estate whose interests also need to be protected. I think tenants have a tendency to think that landlords are trying to fleece them, or rather that the managing agent is taking too great a cut or not treating them fairly. So it can be quite a polarizing area of law, service charges, where you have an innocent tenant who's been taken advantage of and an evil large landlord. And my experience is that isn't really the case. Landlords, I would say generally, my experience of landlords is that they are fairly conscientious and want to make a right and fair decision. And unfortunately, that decision sometimes means that a tenant has been treated slightly unfairly, but that's just because in order to treat all the tenants fairly, a decision has had to be made that's quite difficult.
Right, I have a question.
Go on.
I have a question from Jean. She says, I manage a mixed-use building, 10 commercial units and 50 residential units. The lease permits the landlord to change the apportionment of service charge paid between commercial units, residential units and the garage, and that the landlord's decision will be final and binding.
Very good. I would get a surveyor. Get the surveyor. You always need another layer of someone to sue. Get the surveyor in and ask the surveyor, and you might want to diarise this every 5 or 10 years, or more often if there are material changes in the makeup of the building. But certainly to keep under review in reasonable periods of time, that the apportionment, and the most fair way of dealing with that is asking a surveyor, maybe a large company of surveyors, to take a view and to help you to make a decision on what should be apportioned and how. As a manager, you've got lots of things going on, and the last thing you want to do is make a decision which is not demonstrably fair, and you have to demonstrate it, and that actually takes quite a lot of time. So it might be worth getting a quote for a surveyor. It might well be a case of you having to consult all of the tenants on that particular expense to decide what the correct apportionment should be. But all the tenants, commercial and residential, would need to know that that might lead to either their service charges going up or down, or a mixture of both, and it doesn't make very much difference. But that you will be basing your final decision on the surveyor's recommendations. And I think that would be a very robust decision to make.
Cool. Okay, we've got 3 more questions that have come in. So question 1, are there any cases you know where the decisions were clearly bonkers and unhelpful, but are now a binding case? That's number 1.
No, I can generally see those reported cases usually work themselves out in the wash. There are bonkers cases that end up being decided in the first tier tribunal, and then for commercial reasons they're not appealed because the amount of money involved in them is so small. Those cases that end up in the upper tribunal, court of appeal, or the high court are ones where there's a lot of money involved, millions of pounds involved, and usually they are decided in a way that you can see they're sensible. So for me, no, nothing bonkers that we need to deal with. Over the last year in particular, actually, a lot of bonkers decisions that have been made, not in this area, but in others, have actually been resolved. So there is a, perhaps because over the last year, us lawyers have had a little bit more thinking space, particularly at the beginning of March 2020, when we had a couple of months of being very, very quiet. A few of us got together and decided to have a go at some of the bigger nuts decisions. And by the end of last year, a lot of them have been ironed out. So not for me, but I'm pleased to say that the state of the law in terms of what's coming in and out of the courts is fairly sensible and robust at the moment, and it's a particularly robust and helpful decision for landlords.
Okay, so we've got another 3 questions to get. Oh, we've got 3 questions to get in 7 minutes. So you up for it?
Yeah, I'm up for it.
Okay. So if the landlord occupies part of the building and lets the other parts out, how can he be subjective in the apportionment, as he will want to try and minimise its liability and maximise his recovery?
Surveyor, get a surveyor in, get another layer between you and somebody else, because that is absolutely ripe for the tenant to say it's unfair and unreasonable, whether it is or not. So yeah, if you have to go through consultation exercise, do, but get a surveyor in to do it, because then it is demonstrably fair, and the only way they can challenge it is on irrationality. But if you can demonstrate the basis of your decision, then from a third party who doesn't have an axe to grind, as long as you've given them all of the information that they could fairly need, that's going to be robust.
Excellent. Okay, the next one, how does this sit with the principle that any provision in the lease that the landlord or its surveyor's decision is final is void, as no decision can be to the exclusion of the FTT?
Okay, I see where you're getting at. So the FTT is an independent tribunal that looks at whether somebody has made a bonkers decision. And so they are not a decision-making body for a particular party. They are completely independent of that. So so the lease is the contract between the parties, and if the lease says the landlord has to make the final decision, then make the final decision. But that is always subject to the law. So the statutory limit is on what is reasonable and what is being properly demanded. So you can't demand from the tenant something that isn't in the lease, and it has to be reasonably charged. So if, for example, if somebody, the landlord hires workmen to do some work on the roof, and the roof work is substandard and causes leaks, it's not the landlord's fault, it's the workman's fault, but it would be unreasonable to charge the tenants for the substandard workmanship, but the landlord would be expected to go back to the workman and say, we're not paying for this because it's rubbish. So there is a trickle-down effect there. What the court is there to do is to police that relationship so that the landlord doesn't basically say, what I say goes, and I am the final say. It is, the landlord does have the final say within bounds, but those bounds are statutory and subject to the tribunal, and that's just the way everything is.
Cool. Okay, and the final question. Can you recommend surveying companies that specialise in this area?
No, it's unethical for me to do that. No, there are two professional organisations, the Solicitors Regulation Authority and the Bar Standards Board, and they encourage us by saying it's a matter of ethics not to recommend a particular firm or service provider. And I have to say, in the past where I've recommended a service provider and that unfortunately the person didn't like the advice they were given, it reflected badly back. I can't say that I was particularly impressed with the advice they were given, which was disappointing for me because, you know, as a professional, I mean, I'm really proud of the work that I do, and I want to do a really good job all the time. And if somebody else makes a bad decision and I've recommended them, then even though my experience in the past has been really excellent, you know, you're only as good as your last performance. So, so 2 points there. One, I see people on the circuit who make good decisions and are good day to day, but that doesn't mean they're the best for you. Only you know, only you can make that assessment when you have a look at who you'd like to instruct. And secondly, it's an ethics point that I'm not allowed, in fact, or shouldn't. It's discouraged. It's discouraged as an ethics issue.
Well, I suppose you can always go to Rix. Probably have got some good advice on who to go to. And I think a lot of the professional bodies all have people that they would recommend. So if you go to the ALET website, they'll have people they recommend. Armour, again, will have people to recommend. So I think that's the route I would go.
Yeah, thanks for that, Charlotte. Yeah, all of those organisations.
Yeah.
But the other thing I would say is that, you know, News on the Block and organisations like this are absolutely excellent in giving networking opportunities. So what I would encourage you to do is find similar organisations and share good practice and see who you instruct. And it might be that somebody that you talk to has got a better firm or a better way of dealing with it, and you didn't know that something was slightly better. So this is why these conferences are absolutely excellent, and unfortunately why Zoom is a bit inadequate for networking. But I hope that you do have, in the course of this conference, time to share good practice and maybe connect with each other. And certainly, I hope that in the next year we see each other in person and can share some good practice.
Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice? Live events. Hey, happy days. So look, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Great questions. I hope our audience found it really useful. We're going to be back tomorrow in the morning. We're going to be talking about drones with Adam Davis from Kendrick. And in the afternoon, we're going to be talking about mediation with Roger Levitt. So we've got two kind of different topics for everyone tomorrow. So once again, Elizabeth, thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you ever so much. Looking forward to seeing you all in person in due course.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye-bye.